everyone, and welcome to the 2021 virtual Gaithersburg Book Festival. I'm Amy McGuire, your host for this presentation. Before we get started, I'd like to ask you to support these authors by purchasing their books from our wonderful bookseller, Politics and Prose, one of America's premier independent bookstores. You'll find purchase links in the presentation description. Given all that we've been through over the past year, it's so important to support local jobs and the local economy. I also want to extend a big thank you to our 2021 featured sponsor, the David and Michael Blair Family Foundation, for their generous support. Okay, let's get started. Today we have with us authors Constance Sayers and Liza Nash Taylor to discuss their new highly acclaimed Jazz Age novels. In Ladies of the Secret Circus, Constance Sayers weaves a magical tale spanning from Jazz Age Paris to modern day America of family secrets, sacrifice, and lost love set against the backdrop of a mysterious circus. Constance Sayers is the author of A Witch in Time, a finalist for Alternating Currents' 2016 Luminaire Award for Best Prose. Her short stories have appeared in Souvenir and Amazing Graces, yet another collection of fiction, by Washington area women, as well as The Sky is a Free Country. They were nominated for the Pushcart Prize and Best of the Net. Etiquette for Runaways by Liza Nash Taylor is a sweeping Jazz Age tale of regret, ambition, and redemption inspired by true events, including the Great Moonshine Conspiracy trial of 1935 and Josephine Baker's 1925 Paris debut. Liza Nash Taylor's work has appeared in Gargoyle Magazine, Deep South, and others. Her debut historical novel, Etiquette for Runaways, is listed in Parade Magazine's 30 Best Beach Reads of 2020 and Frolic's 20 Best Books of Summer 2020. Moderating today's discussion is Norah Vawter. Norah is a freelance writer and editor, as well as local authors editor of online magazine, dctrending.com. She's published essays in the Washington Post and Memoir magazine, as well as fiction in New Washington Writers Publishing House anthology, This Is What America Looks Like, the Nassau Review, and the Gavi magazine, among others. Welcome, Constance, Liza, and Norah.
As I was reading these books, I kept thinking, there are so many interesting connections between these novels. There are so many similarities and so many differences, and it just like, what a great pair of books to choose. And I didn't choose them. So kudos to the festival for pairing you guys together. And I have to just say really quick that as a writer and a reader, one of my favorite things to do is talk to writers, because I love to find out where the story came from, and everybody's mind works differently. I think sometimes people think that all writers kind of work the same way, but we don't. So I am just excited to talk with you guys. How's everybody doing?
Good. Thank you for this. This is wonderful.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And yeah, this is wonderful. I wish we were all in person in Gaithersburg, but this is great.
Yeah, me too. Next year, maybe next year. So why don't we get started by having you guys both talk a little bit about your book, how it came about, why you wrote this particular book.
Sure. So Ladies of the Secret Circus kind of came about as I was researching my first book, A Witch in Time, which came out last year, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And so as I was doing, part of that book takes place in Belle Epoque, Paris, and I kept, in my research for that book when I was in Paris researching it, I kept coming up against images of these amazing circuses that they had in Paris back in the turn of the century up into the Jazz Age and kind of beyond. And French circuses are very different than the American carnival type circuses. They are, housed in buildings. Still, there's the Winter Circus is still there and housed in these beautiful buildings. So they were much more of like an opera-ish type of experience. And you'll have like Toulouse-Lautrec doing a fair amount of paintings around, so the Cirque Medrano and Cirque Fernando of the time. And so it was just fascinating to me. And I kind of put it on the back burner as I was finishing my first book, but kind of thought like, I'm going to come back to that. And then I remember this idea of sisters who were part of the Circus. And I remember just pitching that as my second book to my editor, Sarah Guan, at the time at Hachette. And she was like, I love that. And so from there, that's just kind of how it formed. But I actually kind of owe a great debt of gratitude to the research I did for my first book.
That was so interesting. And I had no idea before I read your book about this tradition of circuses that is completely different from, the kind of podunk thing that came through my town when I was a kid. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, women were in, cocktail gowns and and they had cocktails. And I mean, it was just, it was a very, very different experience.
Yeah. It's very interesting. Very interesting. What about you, Liza?
Well, like Constance, research shaped my plot a lot. I started the book here in this house where I'm sitting, Keswick Farm, which appears in both of my novels. The house was built about 1825, and I had recently broken my ankle, so I was stuck at home while I was starting the book. So that made me decide to set it right here. And then from there, research really led me down the path to the 1920s and to Jazz Age Paris. Knowing that the book was going to be set here in Albemarle County, I had to come up with a time that was interesting when there was a lot going on in my neighborhood. And that was during Prohibition, because there was a lot of moonshining going on. And from there, to come up with my character, I found a piece of a doll's face in the dirt, because we find old horseshoes and bottles and stuff all the time in the dirt that people threw away 100 years ago. And this doll's face I found, I wondered whose doll it had been and what that little girl's life was like here at Keswick Farm. So that really started the whole thing. And then getting into the third part, where my character ends up in Jazz Age Paris, like Constance, it was research that took me there. And I was researching Josephine Baker's life. And that just led me to want to write about that time and that place.
That is so interesting. So does the research come first for you, or does the character come first? How does it work?
It's varied for me. The first time it was the place, the first novel, it was the place, and then the character. And then I keep finding what I love, which I call rabbit holes during research of finding out about some small event in history that I didn't know about, that can just turn your plot on its axis. And I just love that feeling when you come across something like that. And for Etiquette, for Runaways, it was the discovery of this big moonshining trial. And then also, as I said, the research on Josephine Baker at her debut in Paris at the Théâtre des Champs-Élysées, both of those things. And then my second book, I had the experience of, Constance, I don't know if you've had this happen, of a character popping into your head and won't be quiet until you start writing them.
Right. Oh, definitely. I mean, and I think, just like you were saying, for me, I started with plot, but I always kind of knew that I wanted a historical novel. So prior to writing this, I had written a novel that failed to sell, that was a just modern day. There was no fantasy, attached to it. There was nothing historical about it. And I just think it was a little flat. So it didn't sell. I was devastated. And my agent said, well, you have that other thing, that was really interesting. And it was the fantasy novel about the woman with many lives. And that became A Witch in Time. And so with that, I think that it was very historically driven, just because I had 4 time periods. So in that case, though, it still was the character development, I think, for me, that came first. The one thing I think that you can kind of unfortunately have happen whenever you are writing historical novels is the history can take over. And then you're kind of like, it's one thing to find a rabbit hole, just like Liza. I love going down rabbit holes. And sometimes you'll find like little gifts, and it's like it supports the time that you put something in. It's like, oh God, that completely dovetails with exactly what I was trying to do. So you're on the right path. I think the danger sometimes for people who are starting off writing historical novels is the history can bog it down. And that can be, you are still writing a book that needs to have characters and some forward movement and things like that. And so I do think that that's just the one thing that I fight with myself on a little bit, even when I am kind of paralleling doing historical research while I am actually writing, is that I'm, trying to keep the through plot, in all the characters. And I agree with you. I mean, I had a character that was a very small character in Ladies of the Secret Circus that became really a main, with the Edward Binghamton Barrow character became a real key player to my plot. And that was a surprise. I mean, your books do surprise you. At least for me, they do. And that's what I love about this process. Otherwise, I'd write nonfiction books. Not that there's anything wrong with that.
What would you say to a writer who is starting out and they have a book that's half done and it's not working? I'm sure you've been there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what do you do? Do you throw it out? Do you put it aside?
Oh, I'll actually take this one. Was that book that I told you that failed to sell?
Uh-huh.
The main character in that book was Laura Barnes, and her fiance didn't show up for his wedding. And it was a true life story. And it was kind of, I had fashioned it as like a Citizen Kane kind of like, you're going to learn all about this man who changed these lives by not showing up, and you'll find out at the end. Well, just to be, perfectly candid, I had signed, I have a 3-book deal with Hachette, and the second one was due within a year. And that was a very difficult pace for me. Book 2 for me was very difficult just because I had to turn on a dime. After I had a leisurely kind of pace in which to come up with, my first book, the second one had to be, turned in with probably at that point though, within 8 months. And so I was a little bit under the gun to kind of figure out what I needed to do. And so just as a quick hack, I was like, I know these characters, this book didn't sell. I'm going to pick them up and pluck them down as the frame. My books tend to have like a modern day frame. And then you have these ways of accessing the historical portions. So I just picked up my characters, and it weirdly kind of worked. I mean, I think it weirdly worked. I mean, I guess other folks could say it didn't, but I mean, to me, it worked. But I would look at fresh ways. If something isn't working, figure out why it's not working, but also never give up on. I mean, I'm not a writer that just like throws things out, because for me, I have a day job, and writing time for me is precious. So what I have put together is stuff that like I'm not necessarily going to throw away, because like I just don't have the luxury of doing that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that I could advise anybody to ever throw away half a manuscript, but like Constance, I had a multiple book deal, and I'd finished while I was waiting, while my first manuscript was out on submission. I finished the second one, which was a standalone sequel. And I knew as I was writing it what was going to happen 5 years later to my main character from the first book. But as I said, this other character kept intruding upon my consciousness, and I had to write her into the story. And it ended up being a dual narrative, switching back and forth, all within the same time frame. And in that way, I sort of had half the story that I had already worked out in my head, and then a new story that fed into it and ran parallel. So there's always a way, I think, to make it work.
For me, my first draft, I mean, it took me 10 years to write my first book that didn't sell. And so I do think that what you have to do is kind of figure out what phase you're in, which is, for me, that first, that blank page is a little tough, especially when I know I've got a deadline. So, I kind of follow the National Novel Writing Month. I've done that twice, finished it once, but that's how I approach my books, which is that my first drafts are not precious. I get it down on paper. My second and third, revision, points are very, very important. I mean, I have very, very rough first drafts. And I think because of that, but I need to get something in paper so that I can start to perfect that. But then I think, once you have that, then you have this unwieldy thing. And, then you've got to figure out, okay, is it because I don't know how to edit it? So I think, you kind of, as you're a writer, you need to kind of almost self-diagnose what's going on with your writing. So if you can't come to the page, that's a different reason. That's a different thing than if you can't, kind of edit a book through. So I think that, and unfortunately, I do think there's a bit of a solitary nature to writing. You've got to kind of figure that out a little bit if you don't have a good support network, which I do also recommend having that. So people can kind of say like, hey, you're not approaching this in the right way, but sometimes you got to dig yourself out of a hole.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What about you, Liza? How do you approach a first draft?
Well, my first novel I started when I went back to school to study English literature, and it started in the first creative writing class I took when I was 53. I'm 61 now, and the second book, from starting that English class, I'm going in a roundabout way to answer your question. I went to get an MFA in creative writing, and so the second book turned out to be my creative thesis. So I had this wonderful network of advisors and workshops with my cohort at VCFA and my MFA program. So I don't have that now. And working on my third manuscript, going it alone with my agent's input, I need to find, a writing group again to really go over my pages and give me a hard time about things, because you can just write along like la 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 la, and this is great, but nobody, if you don't have someone actively giving you feedback as you go, it's really hard, I'm finding.
No, I agree. Yeah, I think you can come away. I mean, I also so my first my novel was published at 51. So I think Liza and I both, I was not a debut author in the 30s. In my 30s. And it took me a long time to kind of figure out how to, kind of hold a day job while I was going to school for, I have an MA from English from George Mason. And again, very vibrant workshop experiences. I will say I'm grateful to the Writers Center in Washington, D.C., because that became kind of my cohort group. And you do need that. And so, because writing is both solitary, but then at some point you do have to kind of get a sense from people if something isn't working or something is not, so definitely. It's also helpful, I'm very grateful to Karen Tanabe and Elma Katsu, who I know are, and AX Ahmad, people who really, when I was kind of navigating, getting an agent, getting an editor, my first, novel, getting things to come out. I mean, people were really good to me. And that's the thing I think that was the most surprising, was how other writers just came out to be very supportive and to really help me understand the business and what was going on, because I just didn't have that. So yeah, the generosity of writers, I'm always amazed at.
Yeah.
Yes, and the pandemic has certainly brought that out for those of us debuting or having any novel come out during the past year. The generosity of the podcasters and interviewers and book groups on social media, it's really made all the difference.
I mean, there's nothing worse than having to ask for blurbs. I'll just say it. I mean, it's just, and I just, I just went pie in the sky for a lot and just, asked people that, and people said yes. And it's just so wonderful. And then, like Erica Seiler, I mean, who wrote the book of speculation, which is very similar to the Ladies of the Secret Circus. I mean, she did not have to do the things that she did to help me out my book this year. And she just did. And so it really is a wonderful community. But I don't know that necessarily takes place of what, Liza's saying, that second or third pair of eyes that you really need, that critical eye, as something I think only another writer, there are beta readers. I get different things from readers than I do from other writers who are just really gonna, kind of not be nice about deconstructing some things for me that I need, or bad habits that I have.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you like to have people reading as you're writing the draft, or do you like to finish it and have it at a more complete place before you show it to anybody?
Well, as I said, my experience was during an MFA program, so I didn't really have a choice that people were going to be looking at it. And for almost a year, I was in a revise and resubmit status with the previous agent, where she was really guiding the concept of my first novel. And then we ended up having different visions for the way the book was going to turn out. and we could not, I was going through the MFA, so my writing was evolving and I liked where it was going, but I wasn't the same author she had signed with. So we ended up breaking up, and it was very sad, but she gave me a lot of good input on the book, but ultimately it had to go its own way. And I had to go back to square one and find another agent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had the same experience with my agent in the fact that she helped me revise it before she signed me. I'm with Roz Foster, who was originally with Sandra Dykstra and is now with Frances Golden. And she, we actually ended up, we did have the same vision, and I credit her with seeing things in my career that I did not see. So when my first book failed to sell, and she said, we're not going forward with this book. And I was just, like I said, so devastated, but she said, I see a bigger thing for your career than this book. And that was, I didn't see that in myself. And so I'm forever grateful for her. But I had the same experience and you had, that I had an agent actually work with me pretty significantly before she signed me. And I think that was we got a chance to see if we could work together. And she is that person that like still is one of my first readers. I will show things though to my sister, who is, she was my partner on the Thoughtful Dog website. And, she's a writer also. She sees things very, very early just to tell me, gut check if she knows my head enough to know where I want to go with it. And she also knows if it's working or not. And she'll say to me, that's not working. Get rid of that. So get that out of there. So
let's talk about the 20s. What about the jazz age drew you to write about this?
Well, as I told you earlier, I set the book in this house, built in 1820, and I chose the era because of Prohibition and all the moonshining that was going on in Albemarle County, and Franklin County, about 2 hours away, was known as the moonshine capital of the world during Prohibition. Yeah. So once I'd set that, I started doing more research, and I knew that I wanted my character to go to New York, and I put her living in a rooming house in New York where I lived. It was run by a church, and the director was an ex-nun. But when I did some research, I realized it had opened in 1922, so my character could actually live there in 1924. And then when I started looking at Josephine Baker, originally she was a character in Etiquette for Runaways. And my then agent said, no, don't make her a character, write a character inspired by her, because readers will have expectations and you will have to stick to this real person's, to the timeline of her life. And that will constrict you in where you can take your story. And I was upset at first because I had read like 4 biographies of Josephine Baker by then. And I knew a lot of interesting little facts about her, but I had to let that go. Sometimes, Constance, you know this, you just have to take some advice and say, okay, I got to let that go. And so I wrote a character called Janie Mullins, who's named for Janie in Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is one of my favorite books. So once I created this character, I could take her to Jazz Age Paris. I could go to the Theatre de Champs-Élysées in Paris and see where Josephine Baker first performed and see backstage and all that, but just assign it to a different but similar character.
I do the same thing in both A Witch in Time and now in Ladies of the Secret Circus. I do have, Ernest Hemingway is in Ladies of the Secret Circus, as are Man Ray and Kiki, but they're minor characters. They're basically almost like flavor. It's like a flavor of them. But, I make up, and I actually love this. I make up, like Auguste Marchand from book 1 was a complete made and fabricated, painter. But I think there was enough about him that like you almost kind of believe that he was real. And then the same with Emile Giraud. And so I actually love kind of creating these like fabricated characters and almost like forcing them in next to Salvador Dali and seeing if they can like hold their own. And to me, that's kind of fun. And then, even with, A Witch in Time, I had, basically created a composite character of Carol Lombard and put her in the 1930s. And, and that was just in Thelma Todd, it was kind of a mashup there. And again, I think that's kind of fun because then you can have a little bit more creative license with them when you do it that way, versus like you were saying, Liza, there are just expectations that people have if I'm actually writing a book on Carol Lombard. So it was more fun to have her be, Nora Wheeler.
You also have a fictional town in Virginia that is based on, I believe you said, is a mashup of two real places?
Of Culpeper and Middleburg, yeah. And I couldn't find, I wanted it on the river, and it doesn't, Middleburg isn't on the river, but so I was just like, oh, I'll just, make that up. And I had enough, I thought that I could have enough license with that because Paris is so real and people have these expectations of what Paris is, that I thought, well, I could make this up. And then, the thing about it also, I think that it had to be, I don't think I could make Middleburg a magical place that had never had any, that had zero crime. I mean, I'm sure Middleburg has crime. And so I had to make it almost a little otherworldly. So I really was drawing on magical realism for that. So I felt like it needed to be a town, unlike what Liza's doing, which is her real house and her real, town. This needed to be a little more surreal. So I felt like that required, a special town that is not on the map anywhere.
Liza, did you ever think about not having Keswick be Keswick? Did you?
Yeah, I did. I also thought about making up a town, and it just seemed so. I don't know. There was a being that this was the first novel I'd started on. It needed to be genuine to me, if that makes sense. If I was describing the view, the mountains out my back window, or rocking chairs on the porch. So I just started as a placeholder, calling it Keswick Farm and calling the town Keswick. And then I ended up renaming the farm next door, which wraps around ours. I renamed that because it might tick off my neighbors if I put the name of their house in my novel.
Yeah.
But yeah, it just felt okay to use the name of the original name of the house.
About these places, you live in Keswick? Are you from Keswick? Is this someplace where your family has been for a long time?
I'm a native Virginian. I grew up in Virginia Beach and went to Mary Baldwin College, which also features in Etiquette for Runaways. My mother went to Mary Baldwin, and my grandmother went to Mary Baldwin, and she is the inspiration for my character Elsie in the book. So she's inspired by my actual grandmother. I moved to Keswick about 25 years ago, when I married my best husband yet, and so I've been here ever since, and I love it here.
What about you, Constance? Do you have ties to the place that your characters have been for a couple generations?
Well, definitely. I mean, in my first book, I wrote a lot about Washington, D.C. My main character was a media executive, basically had my job. In this book, I also tend to give my characters my jobs. I was a DJ from midnight to 6 at a radio station for about 4 years. And it's kind of got like a lonely kind of romantic kind of, it's a lonely job. And so I always knew I wanted to put that somewhere. So yeah, there's definitely a tie to, I mean, I grew up in Pittsburgh. I moved to the DC area, like I said, to go to George Mason in 1993. I started there in the master's program. And so I've essentially lived in the DC metro area longer than I lived in Pittsburgh. So when I think of home, I actually think of, DC as home. And that took a long time for that to kind of happen. But both of my books, I've pretty stubbornly set them either in DC or Virginia, because I do feel like it's home. Originally, I had kind of had the conception of Carrigan Falls in Pennsylvania, and then just after I didn't live there for all those years, it just didn't feel like it didn't feel like where I was in my head anymore. I was a different writer in that regard. And so I felt like it needed to have a different setting. I suspect, like Liza, place is very important to me. I think that place is one of the least used devices that writers have that can really shape a book in a great way. If you look, and I know it's a nonfiction book, but my favorite book is Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. And it, for me, was such a demonstration of what a book about place. And place doesn't have to necessarily be buildings. Places are the people, and it's the, you know, it's the traditions and things. And that was such a powerful book to me. It's the book that made me want to be a writer after General Hospital, which we do need to get to.
Yeah, I agree. You just cannot get the layers of sensory details if you haven't, for me, if I haven't been to a place. So Paris, who can tell you what Paris smells like, you know? So, and that's sort of my crutch, is that I feel, I always make a pass through my manuscript for sensory details.
Yep.
And that to me is if I know I'm writing about a place I've been to or lived, then it's going to be more plausible.
Yeah. And it's things too, like fashion, food, drinks. So one of the best source materials, I think you had at one point talked about like source materials that help us with writing. One of the biggest source materials that help, I mean, you know, when I research a book, I mean, I've just got volumes. I mean, I have bookshelves devoted to Witch in Time, bookshelves devoted to Ladies of the Secret Circus. I did go to France on 2 separate occasions. I hired a Louvre guide to take me around and walk the streets and tell me things like a woman could not have walked on the streets in Paris alone in 1896 and have been a quote unquote lady. So there are like traditions and things like that that you find. The best gem though for Ladies of the Secret Circus was the book, I think it's called Recipes and Meals of the Lost Generation. And it has all of the favorite recipes of Zelda Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway. And what's so wonderful about it is it has the context in which they ate the food, and it has the ingredients that were available at the time. I mean, things that are just really like, you can get that wrong, and that could be, to me, that could be like a glaring error. And then the cocktails, of course, the cocktails that accompany these. And so like, I actually picked those, you know, those dinners up, like, you know, when you look at what's on their plates, I think those are the things that, again, that are like setting, and setting can be time, and setting can be fashion. And, you know, and I just think that those are the details. That's what I love about historical writing, because you really are, I mean, those are lost to us. And it's really up to us to kind of put the details back, even if they are a little fabricated, with love, that you almost can kind of feel like you are recreating a moment of 1920s, you know, Paris that we'll never have again. I mean, I'm very nostalgic. I think my dad was a history teacher. And so I definitely think that I have such a love and you know, I revere history so much, but like, it's so sad because we'll never get it back.
Yeah. And the same thing happens with language. When I'm writing about a certain period, I'll read novels that were published during the early 30s, or right now, the early 50s, because you get a flow for slang and regional dialect and all kinds of things. I just got from eBay a big stack of Life magazines from 1953, and to see the advertisements and all of the details, I think that's what really can enrich a manuscript and a story, is all of these sensory details.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. I was drawn to the idea that your father's a history teacher, Constance. So was history something that was a big part of your childhood?
So yes. So I'm only laughing because so my father was a Methodist minister first, left the ministry. I only think this because I wrote a book about the devil and demons. I have a very romantic, I think, from as only a preacher's kid can have. I've got that kind of like, you know, kind of, to me, the devil has like a Lord Byron kind of like feel to him. And so you've got this like kind of Gothic, I think, kind of feel to my books. So my dad left the ministry and went back to school and became a history teacher. And so I had like a weird mashup as a kid, because but I think that's kind of what creates, I mean, I think that's where my creativity came from, is that, I had a weird childhood.
Mhm.
And so my dad would, be like a normal teacher in my school system, but then on the weekends he would go and sub and preach for people if they needed, a preacher when they went on vacation. So I had this, like, I mean, and it was like, these didn't always fit, and so, but yeah, I mean, so all of our vacations with all my friends we never went to Disney World. My father would never have gone to Disney World. And I was, sitting on a tank or sitting in a battlefield, or, and I was so bored and hating life so much because, like, my friends were, in Myrtle Beach, and, there was nothing historic there. And so now, though, I mean, I'm that way. Now it's just like, I mean, I am such a history buff, but it's kind of the history you're given in a way. It's really great.
Yeah. What about you, Liza? Did you grow up being interested in history, a particular time period?
I always did enjoy history. I was terrible at math, and I was a big reader. I wasn't one of those authors who started writing at the age of 6 or anything. I really didn't start until my mid-50s, but I loved to read, and I loved historical novels for children and biographies. We could go to the library then and bring home a big stack of biographies. And I loved Joan Aiken, and I'm trying to think of, A Secret Garden was my favorite book growing up, and A Little Princess. And I think I had a secret yearning to be an abandoned English orphan. And then that translated later into loving Jane Eyre and those sorts of, English novels, early English novels. So that's always stuck with me, I think. And I love learning about everyday life by reading a historical novel. And it makes me crazy when somebody gets something completely wrong. I use Google Ngram. Constance, I don't know if you use that. It's a Google program where you can put in a phrase, a slang phrase, or like I was trying to decide, should I call it a garbage can, a waste paper basket, or a trash can?
That's great.
And you can enter the 3 of those terms into the Google Ngram and then adjust the time, and it will show you, like, from 1890 to 1950, it was more often called a trash can than a waste paper basket. And
that's
I'll go
fabulous.
through and check these things, which is kind of a fun. It's like a puzzle.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, and you love these kind of things too. Like, I remember the Brown Derby restaurant for Witch in Time. I mean, I actually got my hands on. I don't know why dinners are so important to me, but, like, Norah was at dinner, and I found the actual 1934, menu from the Brown Derby. I mean, there's still Brown Derby now. I mean, there's a menu, but I was like, no, I had to have the right thing. But you love these little, I mean, and they're cool finds. Like, I mean, you're like on a quest.
I have, I'm going to try and show you. This is a key from the Biltmore Hotel that I bought on eBay. And it has the room number. So this was like my talisman as I was writing the book, that I had this key, and I keep it with me, like, as a good luck charm when I'm doing book events now.
Let's talk about writing women in this era. This is an era that is dominated by some amazing male writers. I worship F. Scott Fitzgerald, but there's not enough female voices writing in the 1920s. So what do you do as a writer kind of approaching, this era? And, you've got some really interesting female characters.
Well, I think, I think for me, they're also, from writing the Belle Epoque period, from writing Hollywood in the 1930s, I try to pick times that have significance, I think, for women. The circus was a weird thing for women because it actually was one of the few industries that really empowered women. So that was not an accident that I put the 2 kind of main, like, characters in a circus, because especially circus is right around the time of World War II, and a little bit before, women were running a lot of this. I mean, like, were the main, especially at American circuses, were big names and big draws for American circuses. So it actually was a very empowering thing for women. But In terms of writing, I mean, writers of that time, I mean, you're right, there is not a lot. So, you have to kind of, I'm lucky in the fact that I'm writing a fantasy book, and the fact that I'm just, I'm drawing on magical things that didn't necessarily exist for women. And that's a conscious choice. I mean, if you take a look even at the work that I did from the last book, I am going up against periods of time that are of significant, in Belle Epoque Paris, like I just said, a woman couldn't walk down the street without a man. She also was at the whim of whoever she married or who her father was. I mean, her choices were so limited there. And so I wanted that time period to feel as constrained as a corset. And the only thing that gets my character out is magic. And that is kind of a statement, because I think that, I mean, as A Witch in Time kind of progressed, it's a very feminist novel. I think you saw that I tried to like kind of map what was going on for women in each of the lives, and how my characters kind of reacted against that. For this book, it was, I think it still was a very, I mean, I make this the statement, I mean, you had all these men, I mean, look, you had F. Scott Fitzgerald, you had Ernest Hemingway, and you had Man Ray, and women were orbiting them. Even if you have Miller and Kiki, they were, I mean, it was, and it was men. And so women were had, I mean, they had things going on then, but it was not, the focus were on the men, without a doubt, in that period of time. So I shifted the focus a little bit, but again, I could do that because it was fantasy.
Yeah. Well, I started my story starts at with my main character in 1924 being thrown out of an all-women's college, small all-women's college, where I was able to go back and research my grandmother's time there, and I had her yearbook, and the rules were just unbelievable. Like, you could not ride in an automobile with a young man without a chaperone, on and on. So starting from that, that real constraint of being a young woman at that time, a naive young woman brought up in the country, going to an all-girls school, May is influenced by the girls from New York and Washington and Texas, and the very wealthy girls that she's thrown in with when she comes on a scholarship. So I was able to sort of show the split there. And then when she moves to New York and Paris, being in the entertainment industry and in the costuming field, that is one place where women actually could find success and excel. They still had to deal with sexism or racism, but a woman could actually find great success, and with the circus as well. So I think that those were, if a woman was good in those fields, she could really make a name for herself in that time period.
You also delve into race in your book, Liza.
In starting my research in Albemarle County and in Virginia in that time, the Ku Klux Klan was here. There were, of course, racial events going on in the South and in Virginia. I chose to show a few instances that I found through research of actual events and fictionalize them, but I didn't want to sensationalize it. And I could not write the African-American characters' their feelings and experiences. I could write May observing what her friends were going through. But yeah, I did base things on actual events, like the troupe not being able to go up the elevator in the New York Biltmore Hotel. They couldn't use the lobby elevator. They had to use the service elevator. So I was just careful that what I portrayed actually did happen, but it felt important to me not to gloss over it.
Yeah, absolutely. She's definitely an interesting person for us to follow through.
Yeah, well, she's naive in many ways, coming from where she came from, and growing up without a mother figure. I mean, she had a mother figure, but her mother was absent. So that's a big part of her story, is having her eyes open, and then going from the States to Paris, where there's much less racism, but it's still there. So she's an observer of what her friends are experiencing in their professional lives and in their personal lives.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And Constance, just jumping over to you really quick. I saw with your main character with Laura that while she's older, she's not
Mm.
18 or 19, she's
Yeah, she's
30.
20.
Yeah, but she also is a young woman who, through her adventures, is kind of being is seeing all of these like uglier sides of the world that she hasn't seen, or kind of
Mhm.
coming into her own through adventures, through being thrown out of like the normal way that her life would have progressed. And I thought that that was such an interesting way to look at young womanhood.
Well, she definitely, we start off the very first time you see her, she is like kind of enchanting a wedding gown, I mean,
Mhm.
and that's the level, she has magical abilities to, you find out that, and you find out that her mother does not really wants to kind of tamper that down. And so she's thrust upon. I actually really love situations where people are thrust into things by, like it's not their choice, and you
Yeah.
kind of see how they come out on the other side of it.
Mhm.
So you see this, this thing happens to her, and and she essentially has to, she goes on a journey to Paris and beyond, you could say, to
Mhm.
find answers out, not only to what happened to her fiance, but also who she is.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's without it, I mean, both of my books are about the journey. One's a journey through time, and the other's a journey
Mhm.
through space, maybe, to, to find out, the answers to who you are, and then how that change. What I'm very interested in, um, and I always see my endings. My ending is I always know where I'm writing to, particularly where I
Mhm.
want the headspace and the mind space of my characters to be at the end, and so I write to that. And so, I mean, hopefully, I felt like with this particular character in Ladies of the Secret Circus, like I had actually written a different ending,
Mhm.
hated it, scrapped it, and I was like, she ends up somewhere else, because after all of this, she would. And so, it felt very authentic to me that like I had originally kind of had an ending, and it just didn't sit right with me. I was like, she wouldn't do that, and so, and that's again, like, you kind of like after you live with the character for a year or more, you do begin to kind of know what they would and wouldn't do. And I like the endings where you definitely kind of you feel like the character definitely kind of ventured through, to earn that spot where you put them at the end. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of ending, I know that we are coming up on the end of our time together. I was wondering, I think that you could read for maybe just a page or two.
It's a nice way to end as well. Yeah.
I think so.
Well, I'll go first. It's what we talked about that
Yeah.
earlier. Yeah, I'll read very briefly. The setting is Paris. It's 1925, and my main character, May, has just been to a party, and with a group of her friends, she's going to a late night nightclub in Paris. And she's accompanied by, you don't need to know the different people's names, but one of the people she's with is a man she's met that evening, and she's interested in him. The Quai d'Orsay at 1 o'clock in the morning was harshly bright and teeming with people. Flaneurs strolled in evening clothes, drunks staggered, and the fashionable prostitutes, the cocottes, lounged against the buildings, blasé as if they did not feel the cold, while the cheaper girls stood along the curbs, calling out to passing automobiles, laughing and opening their overcoats. Philippe's chauffeur, Bernard, stared ahead with an expression of stony determination. In the long Renault, May and Janie flanked Philippe on the back seat, with Gerald and Rocky on jump seats facing them. When the car jostled on the cobblestones, May's knees brushed Gerald's, and she wondered if he felt the same subtle awareness of their proximity. The car stopped outside an imposing pair of carved black doors, where a man in evening clothes and a tall fur hat stood sentry at the end of a velvet cordon. He opened the car door, then bowed. Monsieur de Clermont, please, your table is waiting. May whispered, "What is this place? There's no sign." Gerald leaned forward, and May felt the warmth of his breath on her shoulder. "It's called Magic City. Inside the velvet dimness of the unattended vestibule, a solitary cobalt blue spotlight illuminated an arched doorway. Beyond the arch was darkness. May and Janie moved closer to the men. No one spoke. The quiet was tense and portentous, and passing through the cobalt light felt like stepping through the proverbial gates of hell, with everyone's skin glowing a momentary, silvery death blue. They proceeded down a long passage, lit only by tiny spotlights, which at intervals offered small puddles of cobalt light. Music and laughter became louder, and ahead, flash bulbs were going off like rapid bolts of lightning. As they entered a cavernous room, someone called, "Monsieur de Clermont, a photograph, please." Popping flashes reflected off mirrored balls rotating overhead, and the room appeared to spin. May was entranced, watching dots of light race around the walls, illuminating among the people in evening dress, a shirtless matador, a Viking couple, and two garçons, women with cropped, pomaded hair wearing tails and top hats with matching monocles. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Great. This is the first time Laura, this is actually chapter 21, but it doesn't give anything away. And it's the first time Laura sees the circus. So I'll start. The night air in Paris was sticky and warm, giving little relief. Feeling the need to dress for the occasion, Laura had worn a black dress with strappy sandals like she was going to a dinner or a concert. Slung over her arm was a denim jacket, and then she heard it again, the clicking of heels, a woman's heels. Laura spun. The noise was coming from the corner near Rue Vivienne, where the streetlight was out. She felt a chill run up her neck. Come on, come on. She looked around, waiting for something to change. Silently, she began the chant. Vercatus, locis te gratato. From a distance, she heard a church bell begin to clang. It was 11. As if her vision were bending, she saw the pillars in front of her warp. At first, it was small, like a ripple when you throw a stone in the water. Within seconds, the smooth waves began more pronounced, like someone was trying to tear through the scene. The streetlights dimmed, making a charge noise as the scene in front of her, the massive building with pillars, gave way. In its place emerged a giant round arena with an opulent gold entrance complete with a devil's open mouth. Laura gasped. The devil's mouth. It was just as Cecile and Barrow had described. Looking back toward Rue Vivienne, she thought she saw the outline of a woman standing under the dead street lamp, waiting. She stared in that direction, letting the woman know she wasn't backing down. Straining her eyes in the dark, Laura couldn't make out if it was the same woman from the Père Lachaise. There was a steady hum as if fluorescent light had just been turned on after a lengthy recess. 4 sets of pillars led the way to the door, gaslights illuminating the path. Like a picture coming into focus, the circus, with its matinee sign, became clear. Laura looked down at her ticket. If she threw the ticket down now and ran, would this scene disappear? Tempting though it was to flee, she stared out at the figure of the woman standing in the shadows. If she didn't go through the doors to the Cirque Secret, then she had to face whatever was out there, knowing it was that woman. No, it was safer to be inside this circus. Blinking, she took the scene in front of her. An entire circus had just materialized in front of her eyes, supplanting a Parisian landmark. She looked around. The waiter at the nearby cafe continued to stack chairs as though the entire square had not transformed in front of him. Without a ticket, perhaps it hadn't. For goodness sake, get in or get out. Laura looked around the pillars to find a clown holding a miniature version of himself, a ventriloquist dummy. Doro. From Cecile's journals, Laura felt that she knew him already. Yes, you. The clowns were dressed identically, all in white, from the face paint to the fez hat to the costume. Above her, a horse whinnied. Was the statue alive as well? Amazed, she spun around, not unlike Dorothy, who had just entered Oz. Ms. Barnes, the dummy's hand pointed to the door. This way, s'il vous plaît. As the clown walked, the dummy peered around him. I am Doro, or he is. The little wooden hand pointed up to the clown, who held out his hand to claim her ticket. She was reluctant to give it up. The ticket does not belong to you, snapped the dummy. It was the same dread she'd felt entering a fake haunted house for Halloween. She expected to be entertained, yet there was a foreboding sense in the background. Laura nodded and handed the larger clown the ticket and watched as it melted into his hand. As she stepped into the carpet, it rolled up behind her, giving her the sinking feeling that perhaps the ticket was one way.
That was lovely. Thank you, ladies, both for joining me here. This was such an interesting conversation and for writing these wonderful books. Do you have another project that you want to tell us about that you are working on, or anything that's coming out soon that people could be looking for?
Yeah, I actually have a book coming out in 2023, I believe. And Liza, it's got a dark shadows vibe to it. We were talking about, we're like kindred souls here, General Hospital and Dark Shadows, and so it's about a film in France, of course, in the 1967, a horror film, when something goes terribly wrong, and just think kind of Dark Shadows.
Yeah, that sounds great. Well, my novel comes out in paperback in August, and here's the paperback cover.
Gorgeous.
And then my second book comes out in August as well. It's called In All Good Faith. This is the advanced reader copy. And it's that's actually the view out of my backyard. It continues May's story 6 years later during the Great Depression.
Oh, wow.
That's great.
Okay. That's fantastic.
Hi, everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to Liza, Constance, and Norah. That was a fantastic conversation. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you, Norah, so much.
Thank you,
Great
Norah.
discussion.
Thank you,
And thank you,
Liza.
Constance.
And I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for this presentation. We have an amazing lineup of programs for both adults and children throughout the month of May. You don't want to miss it. Please go to Gaithersburgbookfestival.org and look over the schedule so you can plan your festival month. Before you go, we have a special message for you from the amazing author and bookstore owner, Ann Patchett. Enjoy, everyone.
I'm Ann Patchett here at Parnassus Books with my dog Sparky, and I want to tell you the importance of supporting your local independent bookstore, Politics and Prose. They are a remarkable partner with this book festival. Now, when a book festival is live, it's really easy. You just go to the table and you buy your book and then you go to the event. But when a book festival is virtual, it gets a little trickier because you're home and you might think, well, I'll just buy the book on Amazon. So I'm here to tell you, don't buy the book on Amazon. For one thing, Jeff Bezos has enough money, right? He's trying to colonize the moon or something. He doesn't need anything that you've got. Politics and Prose, on the other hand, they're your local independent bookstore, and you love them, and they bring you so many events. They work harder than any bookstore I know in their community. And if you want them to be there alive and healthy and well when all this is over, you actually need to support them. They are the people that are putting a tax base in your community, okay? So you have teachers and police officers and firefighters, and when you pay a couple dollars more for a book, you're creating jobs in your community. So enjoy your book festival, support Politics and Prose. Remember, Ann Patchett and Sparky think it's the thing to do. Shop local. Thank you.